Hi, I'm Julie and welcome to Weekends with Wisej, a video series where we'll use wisej.net to make a video game. It'll be co-hosted by me and Lawrence. It's not a traditional way to use Wisej, but it should be a lot of fun. All the code will be on GitHub, plus you can follow along with me here. So let's go ahead and get started. So I'll open up Visual Studio. Let's go ahead and create a new project. We will go ahead and use the web page application. We'll call it Game 2. We'll just go ahead and go with net 8. Alright, so this is our new project. So let's go ahead and open the designer so we can click on page1.cs. You have to wait for the little icon to show up. Sometimes it takes a little bit when you first create a project. There we go, there's the icon. So double click. Alright, so this is the designer. We can go ahead and drag in whatever we need from the toolbox. In this case, I'm going to want a picture box and a button. So I'm going to click here to open the toolbox. You could also click up here. Let's add a picture box. And this is where we're going to render all of the objects in our game. I'm going to go ahead and rename this here. So you can see here's the properties of the picture box. I'm going to rename it. We will call it Game Canvas. And let's set the size. Going to go ahead and do 640 by 480. And now let's go to the toolbox and create a button. And we'll delete the text. We'll name it button up because this will be the button for the up direction. Let's set the image. Let's set the image source. We're going to choose a theme image, just an icon here. There we go. Let's look in the events. You can see the click event. And here's the code for the click event. Let's go ahead and add a new item. We're going to add a C# class here. We'll call it GameGrid. And this will represent the grid for the game. So every object in the game will be stored in a space in this grid. For now, it'll just be an array of strings. And let's paste in the code here. Okay, so I've pasted in the code. Let's go ahead and take a look at it. So here is our grid, right? It's a two-dimensional array of strings. And in the constructor, you can see that we set up our grid, right? We have two parameters, x dimension and y dimension. That's the number of squares the grid has horizontally and vertically. And then right here is where we actually create the grid, right? It's a new string. And then the x coordinate is x dimension, y coordinate, y dimension. Okay, so that's our setup of our grid. And then we've got a couple methods here. So this one, write to grid, takes a string and two integers. So the string will be the string that represents the object to be written to the grid. So it might be something like player or wall. Later on, we'll read that string, and then we'll actually render an image to the grid, to the screen. And then x and y are just the coordinates of the object to be written to the grid. So we'll do check valid coordinates, which I'll go over in a second. And if the coordinates are valid, then we'll just set that code, right? We'll just set it to the grid. And then I have a note here, right? Later on, we need to add some code for checking with collisions, right? Because if we just write things to the grid, we could be overwriting something else. Think of writing a player on top of a wall, right? So we might need to check for that later on, and we'll get to that later on. And then here, so I mentioned check valid coordinates. here's the code for check valid coordinates. It takes two integers, x and y, the x and y coordinate, and all this does here is just check that those coordinates are within the grid area, right? So if we remember, arrays start counting from 0, right? So if the coordinates are 0, those are valid coordinates, right? That's why we have x and y greater than or equal to 0, because 0 is valid. But we do have to remember that the last number isn't a valid coordinate. So like, for example, let's say the x dimension is 5. There's 5 squares along the x-axis. Well, then you'd have spaces for 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Notice there's no 5, right? There are 5 squares in total, but there's no square at location number 5 because there was 1 at 0. So that's why we have less than instead of less than or equal to. And then here we're just getting the length of the grid along the x-axis, so 0 because x comes first. And then here getting the length of the grid along the y-axis, so 1. And then we have read from grid. So, write from grid, read from grid. So this would just take two coordinates, x and y. And then we're going to make sure they're valid. And then if they are valid, we'll return the object at that location. And then if they're not valid, we'll just return the string error. So if we get this, we know that we were trying to read from a grid square that doesn't exist, that's out of bounds. Okay, so that's GameGrid.cs explained. Okay, so back in page1.cs, let's look at the button click event. Let's go ahead and add an alert box here so that we can display something whenever we click on it. And it'll just show the word clicked. Let's run the program. You can see off to the side, here's our button. That's where the canvas will be over here, and here's our button. Click on the button, it says clicked. All right, so our button click event is working. I'm going to go ahead and change the background of this canvas here so that it's a solid line. There we go. And let's run it again. There we go, solid line. So now we can see where the canvas is. All right, and let's add some code here to the button click event so that we can actually test out our grid. And let's go over this. So GameGrid grid equals new grid 5, 5. So we're just making a new grid, coordinates 5 by 5. Write to grid hello 1, 4. So we're just going to write the word hello to it. And then we're going to read from the grid at those same coordinates 1, 4 and show it in an alert box. So let's click on the button. And there you go, it says hello. So we can successfully write and read to the grid now. Okay, so the next thing we want to do is actually paint the player to the screen. There's two parts of this. We're just going to paint them to the screen, and then we're going to read from the grid and paint to the screen based on the location in the grid. But first, let's just get something showing in that canvas. So I've got a couple of images here. So we've got an image for bullet, grass, player, and wall. We really just need player at the moment, but let's go ahead and import all of these images. So the first thing I want to do is I want to actually put a copy of the images in a folder in here. So let's create a resources folder here. I'm going to right click, open folder in File Explorer. So you can see this is my project. This is where all the code is. And I want a resources folder. Let me just go ahead and copy that and paste that in here, and you'll see it shows up in the Solution Explorer right here. And there's our images, bullet, grass, player, and wall. So this isn't quite good enough. We need to actually get them in a resx file. So the way we can do that, if I just go here to my designer and click on this button, click on the little button here to open up the options. And so we already have an image for it, right? It's the up arrow. But I'm just going to use this to import the other images. If I imported it as a local resource, it would only be available in page 1. But in this case, we want it available in the entire thing. So we're going to do it as a project resource file. And I'll hit import. And then you just need to navigate to where the images are. So we'll do the bullet, and then this will be easier for the rest of them. The grass, the player, and the wall. Okay. So we've got all of these all imported. Hit OK. And okay, so let's go ahead and render our player. So I need to attach the paint event of the game canvas. So if I scroll down, there's the paint event. Double click on it. Okay, and let me paste in some code here. Let's go over this line by line. So field dimension equals 16. Field dimension is just going to be the size of one square of the grid. Our player image is a 16 by 16 image, and so is every other image that we're going to use in this game, so they each fit into one grid square. The image, so this is where what we did earlier in the designer helps, right? So properties.resources.player. So you'll notice the name of the image is player.png, and then when we were in here and we clicked on here and set our images, right, we were loading them in resources.resx. So actually, if you take a look at that file, so resources.resx, double click, you can see these are our 4 resources, the bullet, grass, player, and wall. And you can also take a look at the actual code itself that was generated when I set those up. So here we go. So here's the code for the player, right? But anyways, so this code sets image to be the player image, and then point. So this will be the location where the player is going to be. So it's a new point, and I did it at the coordinates 1, 4. And then field dimension here is we're multiplying it by field dimension just to make sure it ends up in the correct space in the grid, right? Because if I just did 1, 4, it would be 1, 4 pixels in, but I actually want it 1 times 16 to be 1 grid square in, and 4 times 16 to be 4 grid squares in. And then this last thing here would just take E, which is the paint event args, .graphics.drawImage, and we send it the image and the point of where to draw it. So let's go ahead and save this and run it. And there we go. There's our players. So you can see they're 1 in on the x coordinate and 4 in on the y coordinate. Note that 0, 0 is this corner up here. So a y of 4 is actually 4 down from the top of the screen. Okay, so that is our player rendered to the screen. Okay, let's go ahead and create some constants, and then we're going to loop through each square in the grid and paint it. So instead of just painting this one square with the player, we're going to paint all the squares in the grid. So here are my constants. I'll just quickly explain these. So number of fields x, number of fields y is the number of squares in the x and y direction. So we have a 40 by 30 grid. And then field dimension is this one here, but we're just creating it as a constant. So it's just the size of one square in the grid. So each square is 16 by 16 pixels. And then this is our grid object. So instead of just creating it in the button up click function, we're actually just going to create one here so it's available everywhere. So I can go ahead and change that here. Right, so this will just use the grid that we created here. Let's see. Up here in the page one constructor, let's go ahead and get some things ready. So we'll go ahead and set the game canvas size, right? So we actually already set it to 640 by 480, but here it's just setting it there and it's doing the calculation, right? So number of fields x, so 40 squares times field dimension, so times 16. So 40 times 16. So that's our number of pixels in the x direction. And then we do the same calculation for the y direction, 30 times 16. Our grid is going to be a new game grid, and we're going to send it the number of fields of x and number of fields y, so it knows our dimensions, right? In this case, 40 by 30. And I'll go ahead and get rid of this line of code here because we're just going to use this grid here. The next thing we need to do is actually modify our game grid code. And I'm just going to add some new properties at the top. So this is just our x and y dimension, right? The same things we sent in the constructor, I'm just actually storing them here, which means, of course, that we need to set them, and we'll just do that here. So, right, so you'll send in the value of x dimension, right, and that will get stored in the variable x dimension, which is this variable that the GameGrid class has. Same thing for y. Okay, so now that we've got that set up, let's go ahead and loop through each square of the grid and paint it. I'm going to Control S to save this and go back to page 1. So this is the paint event, right? And so far we're just painting the player at one space on the grid. So instead of just doing that, we want to actually loop through each square of the grid and then paint each square. All right, so here's our code. So we've got a double for loop to loop through each square in the grid, right? So this will loop through each one in the x dimension, and then every time we loop through one in the x dimension, we also loop through one in the y dimension, right? And you notice here grid.x dimension and grid.y dimension are those two new variables we just created, right? So that way we can use those values outside of the GameGrid class. And then our value, right, is read from grid, which if you remember back to GameGrid, we had a read from grid function. Here it is, right? So it checks to make sure the coordinates are valid and then returns the string from there. So we're going to read from the grid at those x and y coordinates. And then from here, I'm just showing the value, right? So just to test that it's working. So we have a pretty empty grid. It says hello, and then it's got a bunch of empty squares. So let's go ahead and see if we get a bunch of alert boxes just to make sure the code is running. And there's a bunch of alert boxes, right, from the initial painting. And then if I click this, it repaints. Oh, okay, I think it's... Oh, no, it doesn't actually repaint. Okay, so I want to repaint the grid every time I click the button. So I can just invalidate the canvas to make it repaint. So if I add this, and then I'll get rid of that. We'll get rid of that alert box so we don't see the hello alert box. And save that. Run this. There we go. We'll do it one more time. There. Okay, so whenever I click on the up arrow, it shows a bunch of empty alert boxes, right? Because it's invalidating the canvas, which then causes this to be called, which then runs through our loop and shows all of our empty values. Okay, so we've successfully looped through the grid, and now we just need to actually render the player, right? So to replace this code with code that actually renders a player to the grid. So we're just going to get rid of this here and put this new code in here. All right, so we still have the first line of code where the value val is read from grid xy, right? So then we test. So if it's not equal to null, right? So if value is null, we're not painting anything. But if it's not null, then let's make a new point, right? So x times field dimension, y times field dimension, right? So this is where we're gonna draw our thing to the grid. And then so if val is player, so remember this is a grid full of strings, right? So we can set it to the player string, and then we'll just set the image to properties.resources.player, right? Same thing that we were doing up here. And then if value is wall, then we'll set it to wall. And then finally, we'll draw the image using the image and the point. One other thing I'm going to do here, I'm just going to go ahead and set the image to grass. So that way, if something goes wrong here, we'll just see a grass image, right? If somehow this isn't getting updated. Let's see what else. Oh, I don't need this here, right? Because field dimensions is a constant. This constant here, right? I don't need to create it again. And I don't need this here because that was to just draw the player, but we're actually doing that code in here now in our for loop. Okay, so we've saved that. Let's go ahead and run it. And nothing. We did not render our player to the screen. Oh, so right now the only thing we're writing to the grid is hello. Let's go ahead and actually write the player to the grid. And I don't really want to do that on whenever I click the up button. I really only want to do it once at the beginning. So let's go ahead and take this and move it to the constructor of page 1, so what happens at the beginning. And we'll go ahead and write player at 1.4. So if I run this, there's our player. And if you remember, I also had code for walls, right? So if it equals wall, it'll draw a wall. So let's go ahead and draw some walls. Right, so just a couple of walls of different coordinates. Save that, run it. And here we go, we've successfully rendered the player and several walls to the screen. I hope you enjoyed this first episode of Weekends with Wisej. New episodes will be posted every other Saturday. Don't forget to tune in. See you soon!